to have a great conversation, I'm sure. I've just spent the last week or so reading Lewis's book, and it's really good. So I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks a lot for joining us, Lewis. And just before we start, I'd just like to say on behalf of the 10 Leeds LitFest partners, a few words, really. Obviously, this has been, goes without saying, really, a really crazy year. And we've really rallied round and tried to bring this festival and create this kind of digital version of Leeds LitFest and make it as possible for as many people to join us, and by making it free, pay as you feel. And we realize these are not very easy times, but there are ways of donating if you'd like to just support us so we can do this for future years. So you can text 2021 Leeds to 70085, and there'll be some information about that in the chat box. I'll be monitoring the chat box. So if you have any questions for Lewis as we go along, please put them in there and I'll pitch them to Lewis later on. So Professor Lewis Dartnell is an astrobiology researcher based at the University of Westminster and studies microbial life and signs of its existence, and how it might persist on the surface of Mars. Alongside his research, he writes regular science articles in newspapers and magazines and has appeared in TV shows such as BBC Horizon, Wonders of the Universe, and documentaries on National Geographic, Discovery and History channels. By taking us through millennia of human history and billions of years into our planet's past, Professor Lewis Dartnell tells us the ultimate origin story. When we reach the point where history becomes science, we see a vast web of connections that underwrites our modern world and helps us face the challenges of the future. Origins has received favourable reviews in the Sunday Times, Washington Post, Mail on Sunday, Nature, amongst others, and the work has drawn comparisons to Yuval Noah Harari and Jared Diamond. I'm about to hand over to Lewis. If anybody has any questions, please pop them in the box. I'm sure they'll pop up. Lots popped up for me as I was reading the book. So yeah, Lewis, over to you. Thanks a lot. Really looking forward to having you with us.
Thanks very much for that, Jack. It's always good to see that people read the press release that gets sent out with the book, with the description of what we would like people to say about it. So good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming along, logging in during these very strange times this year. My name's Lewis Dartnell, as you just heard, and the topic of my research, what my day-to-day science is all about at the University of Westminster, is in a very new field of science called astrobiology. It's all about looking at the possibility of there being life on our next door neighbour planet, Mars, whether there could have been the conditions for the emergence and evolution of simple bacterial-like life forms in the dusty, dry Martian surface. And just as importantly, if that life is there, if bacterial life did emerge on Mars, how could we find it? And what would be the best way to build some kind of science experiment, some kind of instrument to strap on the front of a Mars rover to test for life signs, to look for so-called biosignatures in the Martian surface? One of the missions that I've been involved in is called the European Space Agency's ExoMars rover, and I'm sure you saw on the news in the last week or two that NASA has just landed its own next generation, ultra sophisticated life hunting robot called Perseverance. So if you'd like to ask about any of that sort of stuff, that the spacey astrobiology type questions, we'll have ample time for that towards the end of this session. And alongside all of that research and astrobiology and being in the lab with my PhD students, I take a lot of time in writing books as well, in science outreach and communication. And my last book, The Knowledge, How to Rebuild Our World from Scratch, was a thought experiment. And if we imagine that we wake up tomorrow, go outside and see that civilization has collapsed, there's been some kind of apocalypse event, some kind of global catastrophe, and the cities are left as smoldering ruins, and you and your community of survivors are trying to work out how we could go about recovering everything from scratch. Could you reboot civilization in the way you would reboot a computer after it's crashed? How could you go right back to basics and kind of do Minecraft, but for real? of knowing where to go to find the raw ingredients, the raw materials in the natural world around you, and how to process them and refine them and combine them in different ways to make useful things, to make tools, or to reinvent particularly handy technologies. And so trying to accelerate that process of recovery much faster than it took us the first time in history. So this book, The Knowledge, is effectively a reboot manual for how you could rebuild the world around us that we've come to take for granted, to look behind the scenes and see how it all works. My latest book, Origins, which I'm here to talk to you about tonight, kind of zooms out on that perspective, on that scale even further, and explores not how human ingenuity and resourcefulness and discoveries and inventions have built the world that we live in today, but how features of the planet itself, features of planet Earth that we live on, have had this guiding, defining influence on our human story, right back to our very origins as a species itself, and then through the thousands of years of human history since the origin of civilization, and how these fingerprints of planetary processes can be detected even nowadays in the headlines we read about in newspapers or listen to on the news, on the radio, how even political decisions and who people choose to vote for can often be traced back to planetary and geological causes. And what I want to do for you tonight, in the next 45 minutes or so, is pick out what I think to be the most interesting and fulfilling stories from this book, from Origins. Talk you through some of these stories about these deep, profound links between human history and our planet's history. And we might as well start this story right at the beginning with the making of us, the origin of us as a species. And humans, Homo sapiens, our branch of humans, is just one twig on a great branching tree of human-like species, of hominin apes. And our hominin lineage diverged from the chimpanzee lineage about 6 or 7 million years ago. And over that evolutionary time, we have evolved and transformed from being hairy, tree-swinging, ape-like creatures to upright, bipedal, walking on two legs, naked, hairless apes. We've become very adept at communication and language and tool use and technology. And so alongside all this story of the evolution of humans as a species, there's a parallel storyline about the evolution of technology, of Stone Age technology, going back 2 or 3 million years to the very first crude hand axes, up to much more recent Stone Age technology like arrow tips or spear tips, chiseled out of those rocks. And a large amount of all of that story, of the evolution of humanity, the evolution of our first technologies, all happened in this part of the world, in East Africa. This is the cradle of our species and the other hominin, human-like species. Incidentally, East Africa and Kenya is also where I spent my own childhood. I grew up in Nairobi, going to a prep school called the Banda, which is Swahili for mud hut. I went to the mud hut school in Nairobi and have very fond memories of spending most weekends driving around Nairobi Safari Park, driving around this savanna, grassy environment that we grew up in, we evolved in as a species. And so fundamentally, what needed to happen to drive our evolution from being hairy, tree-swinging, ape-like creatures into upright, walking, human-like creatures is you had to transform rainforest, woodland, into dry grasslands. And this in itself is something of a curiosity. If we zoom out from this corner of the world, this part of the world, and look at the entire globe of the Earth, and you allow your eyes to roll along the midriff of the planet, around the equator of the Earth, you'll recognize that this is where we find all of the great rainforests of the planet. The Amazon rainforest, the rainforests of Central Africa, the rainforests smothering the archipelago of islands of Indonesia and Southeast Asia. The equator is where it's very warm with the sunshine. It evaporates lots of water. That moist air rises and cools, rains back down again, and supports all of these rainforests all the way around the entire equator of the planet, except for a weird, dry corner of East Africa where we were growing up, where our ancestors were living 5-6 million years ago. Something dried out East Africa when it should have been rainforest. And what drove that process of drying out of rainforest to create the savanna that we evolved in is there's been this enormous upheaval and ground movement, a tectonic movement beneath our feet, with the rising up of the Ethiopian highlands, a literal swelling up of Earth's crust, like a giant zit on the face of the planet, which has also caused the crust, the skin of the Earth, to thin and then split and rip open. And the Earth cracked open in this characteristic Y-shaped pattern of cracks. We've got the Red Sea up in the top, the Gulf of Aden to the side of that, and then the third arm of this Y-shaped tectonic cracking is the Great East African Rift Valley. It's a literal fracture in the crack of the Earth. And it's within that Rift Valley where we evolved, where we grew up. What happens is the rising up of the land and the formation of this Rift Valley with walls of mountainous terrain on either side had acted to block moisture-laden air blowing in from the ocean or blowing in from further inland in the rainforests. And so the whole region of East Africa dried out because of the formation of the Rift Valley in this earth movement. But this still doesn't really answer the question of where we came from, of why we evolved. Plenty of places around the earth have dried out, and you evolved the camel. So what was it that was special, unique about this part of the planet 5-6 million years ago that drove our evolution to become so uniquely capable and versatile and intelligent? And the answer that's been emerging over recent years is that there is a overlapping of the tectonic processes that formed the East African Rift Valley with wobbles in Earth's orbit around the sun and the tilt of our planet. These are the so-called Milankovitch cycles. They're cosmic cycles in Earth's orbit, which then have a direct impact on the local climate around the equator. And the interaction between these planetary forces created a string of lakes running along the floor of the Rift Valley where we were living, and these lakes are extraordinarily sensitive to even small fluctuations in the amount of rainfall. And for periods of unstable climatic history, these lakes would flicker in and out of existence and completely change the landscape that our ancestors were living in, from dry to wet, changing the amount of water that's available, changing the amount of vegetation that grew, changing the amount of game animals that we could hunt. So it seems clear now that we evolved to be so exquisitely intelligent species of ape. We evolved our big brains in order to be able to outthink a chaotic, unpredictable environment around us. It is plate tectonics that crafted us and climatic instabilities that crafted us as an intelligent species of ape. Now, we didn't remain in our cradle in East Africa. We came to disperse and migrate out of Africa and come to colonize the entire planet. Today, humans are the most widely distributed animal species on the planet. And what enabled us to walk around the world and colonize the entire planet was another period of Earth's climactic history, which was the last great ice age. From about 60, 70,000 years ago, our ancestors strolled out of Africa. And because the sea levels were so low during the last ice age, they could walk from continent to continent without getting their feet wet. And of most importance, greatest importance for the subsequent playing out of history, our ancestors, our Homo sapiens ancestors, were able to walk from northeast Siberia across the Bering Land Bridge, across dry land that would have been seafloor, into Canada and North America, and then down into South America. Whereas there were plenty of cousin species, other hominin species like Neanderthals or the Denisovans or Homo erectus had reached as far as China in their own migrations. We, Homo sapiens, became the first and only human species to migrate into the Americas. We walked where no human species had ever walked before. And then with the thawing out of this last great ice age, the melting of the glaciers and the ice sheets and the raising of the sea levels, these land bridges once again became submerged beneath the waves and disappeared. And these two great populations of humanity in Eurasia and Africa and in the Americas became severed from each other. They lost contact for 10, 15, 20,000 years until Columbus and other European navigators re-established contact between these two great continental landmasses. But they'd begun their own independent experiments in domesticating wild animal and plant species, inventing agriculture, inventing farming, settling down into larger and larger towns and cities, and seeing the emergence of civilizations in these different continents around the world. Now, one of the first places that might jump to your mind when we're talking about ancient civilizations or a location on the earth that has been a bubbling, frothing cauldron of activity through the Bronze Age and antiquity and the classical era might be the Mediterranean, this inland sea, and an oval-shaped sea surrounded by land on all sides. And we immediately think of ancient civilizations like the Phoenicians or the Minoans or the Etruscans, or the Mycenaeans or the ancient Greeks or Romans. But when you think about it, almost all of this activity, almost all of these cultures and civilizations and empires emerged on one half of the Mediterranean Sea, on the northern coastline, and not along the southern lip, along the North African coastline. For thousands of years of history, there's been this great disparity between the northern and southern coastlines of this small inland sea. And understand why that might have been, what might have caused this great disparity throughout history. We need to wind back the hands of time on our own planet's history to understand where the Mediterranean itself came from. And if we look back into the Earth's history, up in the top left picture here, this is what the Earth would have looked like about 240 million years ago. The continents that we're familiar with, constantly scudding around across the surface of the Earth. And 240 million years ago, they had all collided together and fused into a single giant supercontinent called Pangaea, the All Land. And held within the cup of this C-shaped giant continent was an ocean called the Tethys. And the Tethys Ocean was as large as the Atlantic Ocean is today in its heyday. But over time, once the Pangaea supercontinent had formed, it immediately started ripping itself apart again, being torn into smaller fragments. And these continents, which we recognize in today's map, moved around, and Africa and India rode back north and recollided back into Asia, crumpling up great mountain ranges like the Alps or the Himalayas. And as Africa rode north into Eurasia, it destroyed and swallowed up this great ocean of Tethys. And the Mediterranean Sea that we find today is no more than a mere puddle left behind from this once vast ocean. And it's this fact which also explains this great disparity from the history of civilizations around the Mediterranean. The fact that it is Africa that is riding north and being subducted, being swallowed and destroyed beneath Europe, beneath the continental plate of Europe, has crumpled up the northern coastline of the Mediterranean into this rugged, higgledy-piggledy coastline, which has since been drowned by the higher sea levels to create this intricate coastline, thousands of little islands and archipelagos and natural bays and coves and inlets and natural harbors. The northern Mediterranean coastline is perfectly set up for seafaring societies, for exploring and trading by boats. Whereas the African coastline, because it's Africa that's being swallowed and destroyed in this continental drift process, the African coastline in comparison is very straight and boring in comparison. It doesn't have very many natural harbors at all. It is not welcoming for seafaring nations. And so it is this plate tectonics process which has explained this pattern across thousands of years of human civilizations, from the Bronze Age and the Minoans through Classical era and Antiquity. Now, I wanted to jump forward in this storyline a couple of chapters in human history, and incidentally, a couple of chapters in the book as well, and come right up to the early modern period, to the beginnings of the age of sail, the age of discovery from the European point of view. And take a look now at not how the movements of the land masses and the continents has had a hugely influential effect on our story, but how movements of the atmosphere high above our heads have also had an enormously important impact on history. We're going to look at the global wind machine and how that has helped create the world that we live in today. Now, we're going to start this story in the early 1400s. And the map that I'm showing you here might be slightly confusing because I'm showing you the opposite of what you normally see in world maps. I'm not showing you the landscapes on the continents. I'm showing you instead the contours of the sea floor. In shades of blue, we're looking at the landscape of the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. And what you can probably see running along the left side there is this great big scar across the face of the Earth. This is the Mid-Atlantic Rift, where the Atlantic Ocean is still expanding and spreading along that tectonic fracture along the seafloor. And that big bulge on the right-hand side is West Africa, with Europe and the Iberian Peninsula sticking out into the Atlantic Ocean, with what was to become Portugal and Spain on there. Now, in this chapter of history, in the early 1400s, Europe was a backwater. We were primitive. We were uncultured, unsophisticated, uneducated. We were right on the outside limit, right on the outskirts of this great sprawling continent of Eurasia. We were right on the terminus, right on the end of the trade networks spreading across the continent, like the Silk Roads. And this meant we weren't just the last to receive the commodities and trade goods that were being moved along these overland routes and sea routes. We were also the last to receive any ideas that were also moving around with people, and philosophies and understanding and knowledge and technologies. Europe received the blast furnace 1,000 years after it was invented in China. And by the early 1400s, when Europe was starting to look out into the wider world, trying to go out and explore and make its own trade network, we couldn't head east. We couldn't simply follow back along the Silk Roads. Because at this period in history, there was a powerful Islamic empire that had closed the door. It shut the gateway for Europeans heading east into Asia. And so instead, we had to look in the opposite direction, out west, into the vast, empty gulf of the Atlantic Ocean. And the first explorers, the first navigators to dare heading out into this ocean in their sailing ships were Portuguese and Spanish navigators using the stepping stones of the Atlantic archipelagos, islands like the Canary Islands or the Cape Verdes. These are just the tips of giant volcanoes and mountains on the seafloor that are just about poking up above the waves to create small islands. And when Portuguese navigators, Portuguese sailors, headed down the West African coastline, following the way that the winds were already blowing, following the way that the ocean currents were already taking them, they stumbled across the Canary Islands. But then they get back home again to their home port, they were hit with a fundamental problem. If you're exploring in a sailing ship, how do you get back home again? You can't simply turn your ship around and go back the way you came, because you'd spend the entire time fighting against the very winds and ocean currents that took you there in the first place. And so the solution the Portuguese navigators hit upon in the early 1400s was completely paradoxical to them at the time. In order to get back home, you have to turn away from the safety of the shoreline and the landmarks you know how to navigate by and head out into the expanse of the open ocean to complete what they called a volta do mar, a return of the sea. Head out into the mid-ocean to pick up a different set of winds and ocean currents. And when you've headed further down the West African coastline, this big loop you have to take through the mid-ocean to pick up the winds to take you back home again takes you to the Azores. The Azores were uninhabited when the first sailors got there. No humans had ever been to those islands before. And so these early European sailors were starting to piece together the jigsaw puzzle of how the winds and ocean currents move around the entire planet. And we now have this global picture of this atmospheric circulation. So again, if we start around the equator, which as I said at the beginning of this talk, the equator is where it's very sunny, the air gets very warm, it rises up, rolls over through high altitude, and then descends back down to the surface of the Earth at about 30 degrees north and south. That is very dry descending air that's coming back down to the Earth's surface from high altitude. And so that's where we find all of the deserts. Many of the deserts around the planet are created by this atmospheric circulation, which is the same reason that we find the rainforests around the equator. And then to complete that great vertical circulation pattern, the atmosphere has to return to the equator along the surface of the Earth, and that's just what we call the winds. The only other fact that's important in this global picture is that as the atmosphere is churning round and round in these vertical currents, the entire Earth is rotating beneath its atmosphere. This creates what's known as the Coriolis effect. It deflects the winds in one direction. So either side of the equator, you have a band of winds that always blow towards the west. These are the trade winds. And a band of winds outside that, because atmosphere is churning in the opposite direction, you have a band of winds that always blow in the opposite direction, towards the east. These are the so-called westerly winds. So if you want to knit together the continents and build these huge transoceanic trade routes, all you have to do is hop back and forth in your sailing ships between these two great conveyor belts of wind patterns, blowing you one way across the ocean and then back in the other. And these European explorers are able to exploit this understanding they built up about this global wind pattern to knit together the world in a way that had never been seen before in history. And the first of these world-altering trade routes was the Portuguese route that they established from Europe into India and the Spice Islands. The Portuguese found their way around the southern tip of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. And it turns out that the only way you can sail around the southern tip of Africa, following the direction the winds of the earth blow, is by taking such a wide looping route through the South Atlantic, you stumble into South America. The reason that Brazil speaks Portuguese rather than Spanish is simply that is the way the winds blow. The Spanish, first with Columbus, of course, found their way across the North Atlantic, discovered this entire continent inconveniently in their way, trying to find another route to India. And Spanish explorers crossed North America and became the first European eyes to ever see the ocean on the far side of this new continent. They called it the peaceful ocean, the Pacific. And then bridging across the Pacific Ocean, the Spanish established the longest range trade route in the whole of the age of sail, the Spanish Manila galleon route. They picked up lots of silk or porcelain or other trade goods from China, sailed north until they reached Japan, where they could pick up the westerly band of winds that took them all the way across the Pacific. So they hit the American coastline, which they then headed along that shore down to Mexico, where they had lots of silver mines, which they loaded into their galleon holds and then sailed on the trade routes all the way back across the Pacific Ocean again, back to China. The reason that California was so geopolitically significant for hundreds of years, the reason that cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles and San Jose were founded in the first place, is simply that is the only place you can get to after sailing across the Pacific. That's where the winds deliver you to. That's where you need to build your ports and your cities to resupply those sailing ships before they can head further south. Now, the Dutch found a shortcut route across the Indian Ocean. They cut out the Portuguese from that valuable spice trade by exploiting a band of winds called the Roaring Forties, a particularly intense, powerful band of winds in the southern hemisphere. It's almost literally like a motorway in the ocean. The only problem with using those Roaring Forties as a motorway to shortcut across the Indian Ocean before turning north back to the Spice Islands again is you've got to know where to take your turn off from that motorway. If you miss your turning, you slam into the continent of Australia, into the coral reefs on the coast. And you wouldn't believe the number of shipwrecks along the West Australian coastline from captains who happen to miss their turning in the open ocean. Now, arguably, the most significant of these oceanic trade routes for the subsequent playing out of history was the Atlantic Trade Triangle. And this was established right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where people in Britain and then Northern Europe had worked out how to get machines to make stuff for us, how to mass produce things like textiles, cloth and clothing, and weapons. And these industrially produced, mass-produced items were sailed down that old Portuguese route to the coast of West Africa, where they were sold, and the money was then used to buy human labor, slaves. People were abducted from their homes, put into chains, thrown into the holds of ships, and taken along that trade winds route across the Atlantic to North America, as well as Brazil, where they were forced to work on the plantations, on the colonies, growing sugar, coffee, tea, cotton. And then those raw plant products, the products of that slave labor, were then taken back across the Atlantic along the westerly band of winds to Britain, where those raw plant fibers, those cotton fibers, were then turned into textiles using our machines, which were then sailed back down to West Africa to be sold, to buy slaves, and so on and so on. So this Atlantic trade triangle was like an economic cog sat right across the Atlantic Ocean, being blown round and round by atmospheric circulation and generating huge profits for its masters, for its slave masters, with every turn of that economic wheel. And so the patterns of trade that became established over these hundreds of years of our history were dictated by the way that the winds blow, by the way the ocean currents go. They are dictated by atmospheric circulation. That determined where these European superpowers had to build their ports and their fortresses. It determined the entire pattern of European colonization and empire building, and therefore the very shape of the world that we found today after that earliest stage of globalization. We can still see in the patterns and the structure of the world we live in today, and where cities are, links directly to atmospheric circulation and these patterns of winds. Now, the last story I wanted to tell about these profound links between features of the world we live on and our history and the way that we find the world we live in today is to look at politics, to see how there's this distinctive fingerprint of the planetary and even the political, and how people choose to vote in elections. An example of this that I want to tell you about is in this part of the world, in North America, and specifically the southern states of the US. And if I peel off this satellite map and instead show you the political map, unsurprisingly, the southern states of the US are on the whole a Republican strong region. There is a sea of Republican red in this political map. But the counties in the southern states that vote for Democrats aren't scattered randomly. They're not haphazardly flung across the southern states. You'll see by looking at this map, there is a pattern to where these counties vote Democrat. There's a structure to them. There's a thick band running north and south. This is along the banks of the Mississippi River. And then running right across those southern states is this distinctive crescent arcing its way across America, Democrat voting counties. And curiously, this Democrat voting arc doesn't correspond to anything we can see on the ground or we can see in the landscape. It doesn't correspond to the Mississippi River, doesn't correspond to the Appalachian Mountains. And it's only when you look underground, beneath your feet, at the bedrock geology, does the pattern start making sense. So if you look at the geological map, and I'm showing you now the distribution of rocks beneath your feet, which are about 75 million years old. I've shown you in shades of grey here. And I now overlay back on top of that political map, on top of that geological map, our political map, you'll see there's this astonishing correspondence between 75 to 80 million year old rocks, Cretaceous age rocks, and people voting for Democrats in US elections. And this isn't just the most recent Biden versus Trump election. We saw the very same pattern in the Trump and Hillary Clinton election, and then back across the decades and centuries as well. And this makes no sense at all. These people aren't geologists. They're not digging in their back gardens or indeed their backyards and dating the rock and going, these rocks are 100 million years old. That means I have to vote for Trump, but I wanted to vote for Hillary or for Biden. There's no direct link, of course, from the geology to who people fancy having as their leader. But what there is a long chain of cause and of effect, of one thing leading to the next, back across hundreds of years of human history, and then millions of years of planetary history. And during this Cretaceous chapter of Earth's history, about 75 million years ago, the sea levels were much, much higher then than they are today. The ocean lapped up right through the middle of mainland America in this great inland seaway. And so the rocks that were deposited then are essentially thick sediments of seafloor mud, which came compacted into rock, buried, and then re-exposed by erosion, so that today these Cretaceous age rocks appear along this particular crescent. They're slightly older to the north, slightly younger to the south. And it was realized in the second half of the 19th century, from the 1850s onward, that when those seafloor mud rocks eroded, they give you a soil which is fabulously fertile, a thick, dark, rich soil, which was perfect for growing cash crops like cotton. And unfortunately, as we've already seen in that period of history, that involved slave labor. People brought from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean on the trade winds route, forced to work on those plantations, specifically along that band of Cretaceous age rocks. And even today, hundreds of years after the Civil War, after emancipation from slavery, after the Civil Rights Movement, still today, the greatest concentration of Black African American people live along that band of Cretaceous age rocks. People that unfortunately still today suffer from socio-economic problems of poor opportunities, poor healthcare, poor salary. People who are much more likely to vote for Democrat promises rather than Republican ideals. And what I've shown for you, labeled on this map, is the city of Montgomery. And this was the place where in 1955, a Black woman called Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white gentleman on the bus. The very epicenter of the entire civil rights movement, this movement that revolutionized society in America, began smack right in the middle of this band of 75 million year old rocks. There's this chain of cause and effect from the geology and the planetary through to soil and agriculture and economics and culture and sociology and history to the political environment that we find today. And just to prove to you that I've not cherry-picked the only place in the world we can find this tight correspondence between the planetary and the political, here is an example from our own fair isles. And on the left, I've shown in red the distribution of the Labour vote. These are the Labour heartlands. And on the right, I've shown you the pattern of rocks beneath your feet, which are about 320 million years old. And again, you can see this tight correspondence between the geological and the political. And the reason behind this particular correspondence will become obvious to you when I tell you that the name of the chapter of Earth's history 320 million years ago was the Carboniferous. Those rock deposits are the coal strata. These are the rocks that we dug up and threw into our furnaces to power our way through the Industrial Revolution. And the last step in that particular chain of cause and effect is that the Labour political party grew out of trade unions, principally made up of coal miners. Now, I've only had time in these 45 minutes or so to cherry pick just a few of what I found when I was researching and writing Origins to be the most mind-blowing, fascinating examples, at least that I thought, of these deep links between planet Earth and our history and the world that we find today. And there's a huge number of other stories that I tell in the book, in Origins. I've put a couple of examples up on the screen here. This is basically the clickbait from the book. And so this is everything from what was the original Brexit? What was the catastrophe almost 500,000 years ago that created Britain as an island, that severed us from European mainland? Why do we eat a bowl of cereal or a slice of toast for breakfast? How has the planet determined even what we eat for breakfast? Or why is it that capitalism and the modern financial system was invented in Holland, in the low-lying regions of the Netherlands? So we've got some time for questions now. This is a literary festival, so I would be in trouble with my publishers if I didn't mention that there is an entire book written on all of this stuff about these fascinating links between planet Earth and our human story, called Origins, How the Earth Shaped Human History. You can buy it online. You can get it from the website beginning with A. I would encourage you to try to find your local independent bookshop and buy it through them, particularly at the moment. I've mentioned my last book, The Knowledge, about this thought experiment about how we could reboot civilization from scratch after some kind of hypothetical apocalypse. And I've written some other books about space and the science of astrobiology and searching for life on other planets. So please feel welcome to ask questions about any of that sort of stuff, any of the things I've mentioned during this talk, from astrobiology and looking for alien bacteria on Mars, through to how you might reboot civilization and what you could reinvent when you're trying to recover after some kind of apocalypse, or any of the things I've been focusing on for most of this talk from Origins about these links between Earth and human history. But thank you once again, everyone, for logging in, sitting down in front of your computer at the end of the day and listening to me warble on. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Lewis. That was such a great talk, and I also just want to say how much I appreciate you taking the time to write these books, because it was just a real pleasure to read. It also distracted me. I don't think we'll have time to say how much it distracted me from more academic. Well, you're obviously an academic, and just one thing I really appreciate about the book is the ability to synthesize very kind of like rigorous academic level information into just such an enjoyable read, which I think is quite a rare quality, really.
Oh, thank you, Jack. It's very kind of you to say.
So I don't think I've got time for my questions, really, because we're going to have to finish in less than 10 minutes. So I'm going to dive straight into questions from the box here. But so lots of the book, I guess, is about our unlikely ability to conquer the environment, to become this really effective animal. And at one point in the book, you say, look, we're going to be lucky to last another 10,000 years. Do you see any possibility that we can come to some kind of balance with our environment?
I think we can, and I think we're going to need to, if we are going to, make it to the next chapter of our history, if we are going to survive the coming changes. Global warming is happening. It is definitely happening. It is definitely due to human activity. It is anthropogenic. It's a problem created by us. And we are going to have to adapt to a changing world, a world where some regions become drier and suffer drought and can't grow enough food for themselves. Other regions which start receiving more rainfall and become flooded and so can't grow food for themselves. The risk is that might start driving mass migrations. One of the most clearest lessons from history is that whenever a population of people, when a group of people can no longer support themselves where they're currently living, they will move to a place where they can support themselves and their families. So this is the sort of future we might be seeing, and this is why we should be going to all lengths to try to prevent the worst for climate change. But I'm hopeful as well that the reason we are in this position is as an unintended consequence of our technology, of us digging up fossil fuels, of coal and oil, and burning them in our cars and factories. And if anything, this was a problem created by us as a solution to the previous problem, which is when we had run out of energy before the Industrial Revolution. We couldn't chop down trees quickly enough to power and heat our society, so we started turning to fossil fuels. So it was our ingenuity that created this problem in the first place. And so I'd hope that we could apply that same ingenuity to solve this problem as well. Maybe start looking to things like nuclear fusion as energy sources.
Yes, so we're kind of victim of our success in some sense, although it doesn't look like that, obviously. And I've just got another question here from Andy, who this kind of ties into something I was wondering, really, with your interest in Mars and whether the a kind of human future is kind of post-Earth. And Andy's question is, what percentage chance do you think that the Perseverance rover will find some kind of sign of life, and what kind of life do you think that would look like?
Yeah, so Perseverance is an enormously exciting rover. It is ultra sophisticated, nuclear powered, laser wielding, SUV car sized rover. If you've not already seen the footage that NASA released earlier this week of the landing sequence from Perseverance, we've now got basically high definition video of the landing of this rover from many different camera angles that it carried. I urge you to watch it as soon as this session is finished. It is spine-tinglingly awesome. And Perseverance is also exciting because for the first time it's taking different kinds of experiments to the surface of Mars. It's got a helicopter, it's got a drone on board, it's got an experiment that will hopefully see if we can create oxygen, breathable oxygen from the carbon dioxide in Mars's atmosphere, which is a critical step to supporting humans when we send a crewed mission to Mars. And from my point of view as an astrobiologist, Perseverance is a very exciting mission because of the kind of instruments it has on board that can detect complex organic molecules, so the building blocks of life, and hopefully biosignatures itself, signs of life itself. Now that the trick is going to be distinguishing, is this an unambiguous evidence of life? Is life the only explanation that can account for this particular organic molecule we found? Or maybe it's being produced by the environment. Maybe it's produced by the ultraviolet rays on the Mars, or produced by volcanic eruptions or something. So I'd like to think that Perseverance rover will find the first clear-cut evidence of life on Mars, but we're likely to have to wait to a later mission, which will bring samples of Mars back to Earth so we can study them with all of the labs around the planet. Rather than trying to miniaturize a lab and put it on a rover, we'll bring Mars back to the Earth and then share it amongst labs around the world.
And hopefully that happens before we've wiped ourselves out, right?
And hope that happens before too late.
So we're going to have to wrap up now, but thanks a lot, Lewis. I've got so many more questions. I'm sure other people have. I've seen a lot of kind of thank yous as well in the chat box. So really, thanks a lot for joining us. That was a real pleasure. And everybody who's watched, be sure to get the books because, I've just whipped through Origins. Really, it's a great read. So thanks a lot, Lewis.
Thank you, Jack, and enjoy the rest of Leeds LitFest Festival.
Thanks a lot. And just to say to everybody else, thanks a lot for joining us. There's a lot more events between now and Sunday, and you can just get tickets from those on the website. There's also a quick way of donating, which is just to text 2021 Leeds to 70085, and that will make a £5 donation. And yeah, once again, thanks a lot for joining us, and hopefully see you at more events. Thank you.